The government bubble. While public sector versus private sector workforce distribution is not highly correlated to gender, it is when the focus is on women earning over $100,000 or more. This next chart from the Cato Institute shows that when total compensation, wages and benefits, are taken into account, the public sector has totally outstripped the private sector this decade. Has the productivity of the typical government employee risen so much more than that of the private worker that the government employee is now paid twice as much? Are taxpayers receiving value for their money? It goes further. The vast majority of Social Security taxes are paid by men, but are collected by women, due to women living 7 years longer than men on average. That is not troubling by any means, but the fact that women consume 2/3 of all U.S. health care, despite most of this $2.5 trillion annual expenditure being paid by men, is certainly worthy of debate. It may be natural for women to require more health care, since they are the ones who give birth. But was it also natural for men to finance this for only their wives, not for the broader community of women? The healthcare profession also employs an immense number of women, and not just in value-added roles such as nursing, but even in administrative and bureaucratic positions. In fact, virtually all government spending except for defense and infrastructure, from Medicare to Obamacare to welfare to public sector jobs for women to the expansion of the prison population, is either a net transfer of wealth from men to women or a byproduct of the destruction of marriage 1.0. In either case, feminism is the culprit. This Cato Institute chart of federal government spending shows how non-defense expenditures have steadily risen since 1960. The decline in defense spending, far from being a peace dividend repatriated back to taxpayers, was used to fund more social programs. No one can seriously claim that the American public receives better non-defense governance in 2010 than in 1960, despite the higher price, and as discussed earlier, most of this increase is a direct or indirect result of feminism. When state and local government wastage is added to this, it would appear that 20% of GDP is being spent just to make the government a substitute for the institution of marriage, and yet still has not managed to be an effective replacement. Remember again that the earnings of men pay 70 to 80% of all taxes. The left has finally found a perfect Trojan horse through which to expand a tyrannical state. Feminists can lobby for a transfer of wealth from men to women and from private industry to the government, while knowing that calling any questioner a misogynist will silence him far more effectively than their military fifth columnists and plain socialist brethren could ever silence their respective opponents. Conservatives are particularly vulnerable to such shaming language, and most conservatives will abandon their stated principles to endlessly support any and all socialism if it can be packaged as chivalry, the opposition to which makes one a misogynist. However, there is reason to believe that tax collection in many parts of the U.S., such as states like California, New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts, has reached saturation. As the optimal point has already been crossed, a rise in tax rates will cause a decrease rather than an increase in revenue, and the increase in federal tax rates exactly 1 year from today, on January 1st, 2011, is likely to cause another recession, which will not be so easily transferred to already impoverished men the next time. When men are severed from their children with no right to obstruct divorce, when they are excluded from the labor market not by market forces but rather by social engineering, and when they learn that the society they once believed in and in some cases joined the military to protect has no respect for their aspirations, these men have no reason to sustain such a society. The contract between the sexes. A single man does not require much in order to survive. Most single men could eke out a comfortable existence by working for 2 months out of the year. The reason that a man might work hard to earn much more than he needs for himself is to attract a wife amidst a competitive field, finance a home and a couple of children, and ultimately achieve status as a pillar of the community. Young men who exhibited high economic potential and favorable compatibility with the social fabric would impress a girl's parents effectively enough to win her hand in marriage. The man would proceed to work very hard, with the fruits of his labor going to the state, the employer, and the family. 80 to 90% of a man's output went to people other than himself, but he got a family and high status in return, so he was happy with the arrangement. The four sirens changed this, which enabled women to pursue alpha males despite the mathematical improbability of marrying one, while totally ignoring beta males. Beta males, who were told to follow a responsible, productive life of conformity, found that they were swindled. Men who excelled under the societal rules of just 2 decades ago are often left totally betrayed by the rules of today, and results in them refusing to sustain a society heavily dependent on their productivity and ingenuity. Women believed that they could free themselves from all their traditional obligations, only to find amusingly that they are unhappier now than they were then, while men would still fulfill all of their traditional obligations, particularly as bankrollers of women and protectors of women. Needless to say, despite the chivalry ground into men, eventually they will feel that chivalry requires a level of gratitude that is not forthcoming. To see what happens when the role of the husband and father is devalued and the state steps in as a replacement, look no further than the African American community. In Detroit, the average home price has fallen from $98,000 as recently as 2003 to just $14,000 today. The auto industry moved jobs out of Detroit long before 2003, so the decline cannot be attributed to just industrial migration, and cities like Baltimore, Oakland, Cleveland, and Philadelphia are in scarcely better shape. For those who believe that this cannot happen in white communities, have a look at the white underclass in Britain. The lower half of the U.S. white population is vulnerable to the same fate as the black community, and cities like Los Angeles are perilously close to Detroitification. Additionally, people seem to have forgotten that the physical safety of society, particularly of women, is entirely dependent on ratio of aggressor men to protector men staying below a certain critical threshold. As more men get shut out of the labor market, crime becomes an alternative. Even highly educated men who feel betrayed can lash out, and just about every shooting spree and every recent terrorist attempt in the West was by men who were educated and had good career prospects, but were unloved. While professional men will certainly never resort to crime, what they could resort to is an unwillingness to aid a damsel in distress. More men will simply lose interest in being rescuers, and this includes policemen, who may also feel mistreated by the prevailing misandry. Safety is like air. It is only noticed when it is gone. Women have a tremendous amount to lose by creating a lot of indifferent men. Patriarchy works because it induces men and women to cooperate under their complementary strengths. Feminism does not work because it encourages immoral behavior in women, which eventually wears down even the durable chivalry of beta men, making both genders worse off. It is no secret that single motherhood is heavily subsidized, but it is less understood that single spinsterhood is also heavily subsidized through a variety of unsustainable and unreciprocated means. The default natural solution is for the misandric society to be outcompeted and displaced. Population displacement. So we have arrived at a society where feminists feel that they are empowered, independent, and confident, despite being heavily dependent on taxes paid mostly by men, an unconstitutional shadow state that extracts alimony and child support from men, an infrastructure maintained by men, technologies invented by men, and a level of safety that men agree to maintain. So exactly what has society received from this population of women who are the most privileged class of humans to ever have lived? Now let me be clear. I believe a woman should get to decide how many children she bears, or even whether or not to have any children at all. However, a childless old woman should not then be able to extract resources from the children of other women. Fair is fair, and the obligation of working-age people to support the elderly should not be socialized in order to subsidize women who chose not to reproduce. Let us take a hypothetical example of three 20-year-old single women, one who is an urban lefto-feminist, one who is a rural conservative, and one who is a devout Muslim. The following table charts the parallel timelines of their lives as their ages progress in tandem, with realistic estimates of typical life events. When people talk about falling birth rates in the West, they often fail to account for the additional gap caused by having children at age 23 versus at age 33. As the table shows, a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio of three young ladies takes only 40 years to yield a 12-to-4-to-0 ratio of grandchildren. Consider also that we are already 20 years into this 40-year process, so each of these women are 40 years old today. So how do we estimate the value society will ultimately receive from organizing itself in a manner that young women could choose a life of bar hopping, shopping for $300 purses, and working as government bureaucrats to make the government a more complete husband substitute? If the sight of a pitiful 60-year-old code pink harpy lecturing 12 Muslim adolescents that gender is a social construct seems amusing, then let us move on to the macro chart. This world map shows how many children under the age of 15 existed in the major countries of the world in 2005, i.e., children born between 1990 and 2005, in proportion to the country with the most children. Notably, Mexico and the US have the same number of children, while Pakistan and Bangladesh each have about as many as all of Western Europe. While developing countries are seeing their fertility rates converge to Western levels, the 1990 to 2005 births already seal certain realities. Needless to say, if we move time forward just 15 years, the proportions in this chart reflect what the proportions of adults aged 20 to 35, the female reproductive years, will be per nation in the year 2025. Even the near future belongs to those who show up. Lefto-feminists will be outbred and replaced very quickly, not by the conservatives that they hate, but by other cultures antithetical to feminism. The state that lefto-feminists so admire will quickly turn on them once the state calculates that these women are neither producing new taxpayers nor new technologies, and will find a way to demote them from their present empowered position of entitlement. If they thought having obligation to a husband was such an awful prospect, wait until they have obligations to the husband substitute state. The fabric of humanity will tear. Humans like ourselves have been around for about 100,000 years, and earlier hominids, similar to us, for another 1 to 3 million years before that. For the first 99.99% of humanoid existence, the primary purpose of our species was the same as that of every other species that ever existed: to reproduce. Females are the scarcer reproductive resource, since the number of babies that can be produced does not fall even if most men die, but it does fall for each woman that dies. Humans did not live much past age 40 to 45 in the past, as mentioned earlier. For this reason, the human brain continued the evolutionary hardwiring of our ancestors, placing female well-being at a premium, while males remain expendable. Since funneling any and all resources to women closely correlated with the survival of children, this was a natural priority, with both men and women seeing this status quo as normal. The female imperative was the human imperative. As human society progressed, priorities adjusted. For one thing, advances in technology and prosperity ensured that child mortality fell from about 50% to very low levels, so 12 births were no longer needed to produce 6 children who reach adulthood. Secondly, as humans moved away from agriculture into a knowledge-based economy, the number of children desired fell, and almost all high and middle-income countries have birth rates lower than 2 as of today, with many women producing 0 children. Thirdly, it has become evident that humans are now the first species to produce something more than just offspring. Humans now produce technology. As a result, the former direct correlation between funneling resources to women and the survival of children is no longer true. It was true for 99.99% of our existence, but for the first time, it now no longer is. Yet our hardwired brains have not adapted to this very recent transformation, and perhaps cannot adapt. Women are programmed to extract resources endlessly, and most men are programmed to oblige. For this once valid but now obsolete biological reason, society still funnels the vast majority of resources to women. But instead of reaching children, this money now finds its way into consumer products geared towards women and a shadow state designed to transfer all costs and consequences away from women. Most people consider our existing society to be normal, but they have failed to observe how many resources are poured into women for a reason that is now obsolete. In the 21st century, there is no reason for any resource distribution, if there must be one at all, to be distributed in any manner other than 50-50. Go to any department store or mall. At least 90% of the products present there are ones no ordinary man would consider buying. Yet they occupy valuable shelf space, which is evidence that those products do sell in volume. Who buys them? Look around in any prosperous country, and we see products geared towards women, paid for by money that society diverted to women. From department store products to the proliferation of takeout restaurants, to mortgage interest, to a court system rigged to subsidize female hypergamy, all represent the end product of resources funneled to women for a function women have greatly scaled back. This is the greatest resource misallocation ever, and such malinvestment always results in a correction as the bubble pops. This is not to suggest that we should go back to birth rates of 12, for that is neither desirable nor necessary. The bigger picture here is that a major aspect of the human psyche is quite obsolete, with men and women both culpable. When this situation corrects, it will be the most disruptive event humanity has ever faced. Some call this a variant of the technological singularity, which will happen much later than 2020, more like 2060 to 2065, but even prominent thinkers steer clear of any mention of the obvious correction in gender-tilted resource flows that will occur. The Four Horsemen of Male Emancipation. We earlier examined how the four sirens of feminism unexpectedly combined and provided women with choices they never could have dreamed of before. Some women made positive contributions to society, but quite a few let misandry and unrestrained greed consume them, and have caused the disastrous situation we presently see. Technology always causes disruption in the status quo, always creating new winners and losers with each wave. In centuries past, Gloria Steinem would be a governess, and Mystery would be a court jester. The title of this article is not the Misandry Crisis, or even the War on Misandry. It is the Misandry Bubble, because the forces that will ensure the demise of the present mistreatment of men are already on the horizon. So allow me to introduce the Four Horsemen of Male Emancipation as a coalescence of many of the forces we have discussed, which will shred the present unsustainable hierarchical order by 2020. 1. Game. Learning the truth about how the female mind works is a precious and transcendent body of knowledge for any man. Whether he uses it to become a fully immersed pickup artist, to create a soulmate bond in a lifelong monogamous marriage, or even to engage in only infrequent yet effective trysts with women, a man is free from the crushing burdens that uninitiated beta men are capitulating under. When a man learns that there is no reason for him to buy a $50,000 car, $20,000 ring, $50,000 Bridezilla festival, overpriced house contrary to any logical financial analysis, or a divorce lawyer to save him from ruin even though he was the victim of spousal abuse, there is no greater feeling of liberation and jubilation, equating to a windfall of $2 million for all objective and subjective purposes. When a man realizes realizes that reducing his income by half will now have little detriment to his sexual prospects, he can downsize to an easier job with a shorter commute and lower stress. When a man learns that appeasing a woman is the exact opposite of what he should be doing during the process of romancing and seducing her, that entire humiliating gauntlet of rituals can be jettisoned. The ecstasy of 2 or even 3 concurrent relationships with women of substantially above average beauty are quite attainable to a man who has scaled the summit, which further deprives the hapless betas. Again, male attractiveness to women is zero-sum in a way that female attractiveness to men is not. Thus, while 80% of men have no intellectual capacity to grasp and master game, if the number of solid practitioners even begins to approach 20%, multiple parasitic beasts, from female moochers to the tax-swilling state to the corrupt real estate and divorce lawyer industries, can be effectively starved. 2. Adult entertainment technologies of 2020. What of the 80% of men who cannot conceptualize or master the core skills of game? Won't they be condemned to live a life of frustration, humiliation, and near slavery as second-class citizens? Thankfully, these poor souls will experience a satisfactory release through technology, just like women did through technologies such as contraceptive pills, washing machines, and vacuum cleaners. For a number of reasons, internet pornography is substantially more addictive to the male brain than the VHS cassette or Skinamax content of the 90s. When yet another generation of technology diffuses into the market, the implications will be profound enough to tear the current sexual market asunder. This site has written in the past about how haptic, motion sensing, and graphical technologies would elevate games to the premier form of entertainment by 2012. 3D holographic images with haptic interfaces and sufficient AI will make rudimentary virtual sex a technology available to many men well before 2020. But by 2020, we will see this cross certain thresholds that lead to a dramatic market impact far greater than contraceptive pills and internet pornography combined. A substantial portion of the male population will drift into addiction to virtual sex without even realizing it. For those, mostly women, who claim that the VR sex of 2020 would not be a sufficient substitute for the real thing, the drawback is more than superseded by the inescapable fact that the virtual woman would be made to be a 10 out of 10 in appearance, while the real woman that the typical beta male user has access to would be in the 4 to 7 range. A real 10 is greater than a virtual reality 10, but a virtual reality 10 is greater than a real 7, making irrelevant the claim that a virtual 10 is not as good as a real 10, under 1% of all women, when the virtual 10 is really competing with the majority of women who are 7s and lower. Women are largely unaware of how vastly different the male reaction to a 10 relative to a 7, let alone to women of even lower scores. As single men arrive home from work on Friday evening, they will simply default into their VR immersion, giving a whole new meaning to the concept of beta testing. These sequestered men will be conspicuously absent from the bars and nightclubs that were the former venues of expenditure and frustration, causing many establishments to go out of business. The brains of these men will warp to the extent that they can no longer muster any libido for the majority of real women. This will cause a massive devaluation in the sexual market value of most women, resulting in 8s being treated like 5s, and 35-year-old women unable to attract the interest of even a 55-year-old man. The Wile E. Coyote moment for women will move a few years ahead, and the alphas with game competence will find an even easier field of desperate women to enjoy. Another technology making advancements in Japan is that of lifelike female robots. I do not believe that sex bots will be practical or economical relative to software gaming-derived solutions, simply because such a robot is not competitive with VR on cost, privacy, versatility, and upgradability. Some feminists are not blind to the cataclysmic sexual devaluation that women will experience when such technologies reach the market, and are already moving to seek bans. Such bans will not be possible, of course, as VR sex technologies are inseparable from broader video game and home theater technologies. Their attempts to lobby for such bans will be instructive, however. Another positive ramification of advanced adult entertainment technologies is that women will have to sharpen the sole remaining attribute which technology cannot substitute: the capacity to make a man feel loved. Modern women will be forced to reacquaint themselves with this ancient concept in order to generate a competitive advantage. This necessity could lead to a movement of pragmatic women conducting a wholesale repudiation of misandry masquerading as feminism that has created this state of affairs, and thus will be the jolt that benefits both men and women. 3. Globalization. The third horseman is a vast subject that contains many subtopics. The common theme is that market forces across the world will eventually find a way around legislative fences constructed in any one country. A. Islam. Aside from the higher birth rate of Muslims living in the same Western cities that feminists reside in, an Achilles heel of leftists in general, and misandrists in particular, is their unwillingness to confront other cultures that actually do place restrictions on women. In Britain, Islamic courts are now in operation deciding cases through Sharia principles. British divorce laws are even more misandric than US divorce laws, and so many British men, in desperation, are turning to Sharia courts in order to avoid the ruin that British law would inflict on them. The Islamic courts are more than happy to accommodate these men, and feminists dare not protest too loudly. By driving British men to Sharia courts, misandry is beautifully self-defeating. The irony is that the group that was our enemy in the crisis of the prior decade are now de facto allies in the crisis of this decade. I do not say this simply because I am a Muslim myself. B. Expatriation. While America continues to attract the greatest merit and volume of legal immigrants, almost every American man who relocates to Asia or Latin America gives a glowing testimonial about the quality of his new life. A man who leaves to a more male-friendly country and marries a local woman is effectively cutting off a total of 3 parasites in the U.S. The state that receives his taxes, the potential wife who would take his livelihood, and the industries he is required to spend money on: wedding, diamond, real estate, divorce attorney. Furthermore, this action also shrinks the number of available men remaining in America. The misandrists who project their pathology outward by calling such men misogynists are curiously troubled that these same men are leaving the U.S. Shouldn't feminists be happy if misogynists are leaving? We thus see yet another example of feminists seeking to steal from men while not providing them any benefit in return. The more unfair a place becomes, the more we see talented people go elsewhere. When word of U.S. divorce laws becomes common in India and China, this might even deter some future taxpayers from immigrating to America, which is yet another reason the government is losing money to misandry. C. Medical tourism. The sum total of donor eggs, plus in vitro fertilization, plus surrogacy, costs $150,000 or more in the U.S., but can be done in India for just $20,000 at top-quality clinics that are building a strong track record. While most customers of Indian fertility clinics are couples, there have been quite a few single men opting to create their own biological babies this way. While this avenue is not for everyone, the ability to have a child for $20,000 and even 2 children in parallel with 2 different surrogates in a 2-for-1 bundle deal for $35,000 now exists. The poor surrogate mother in India earns more than she could earn in 10 years in her prior vocation of construction or house cleaning. It's a win-win for everyone involved, except for the Western woman who was priced out of the market for marriage to this man. Medical tourism also prices the U.S. healthcare system out of contention for certain procedures, and the U.S. healthcare system employs a large number of women, particularly in administrative and bureaucratic roles that pay them over twice what they could make in the private sector. Such women will experience what male manufacturing workers did a generation earlier, despite the increasingly expensive government bubble that has kept these women's inflated salaries safe for so long. So as we can see, the forces of globalization are far bigger than those propping up the current lopsided status quo. The final of the horsemen of male emancipation, is male economic disengagement and resultant tax base erosion. Earlier passages have highlighted how even the most stridently egomaniacal feminist is heavily dependent on male endeavors. I will repeat again that there will never, ever be a successful human society where men have no incentive to aspire to the full maximum of their productive and entrepreneurial capabilities. The contract between the sexes has broken in urban America, although is still in some effect in rural America. The progressive income tax scale in the U.S. was levied under the assumption that men could earn 10 times more than they needed for themselves would always do so for their families. A man with no such familial aspirations may choose an easier job at lower pay, costing the state more than he costs himself. Less tax revenue not just means fewer subsidies for single mothers and government jobs for women, but less money for law enforcement as well. Less tax revenue also means fewer police officers and fewer court resources through which to imprison men. The feminist hypergamous utopia is not self-financing, but is precariously dependent on every beta man working at his full capacity, without which the government bubble, inseparable from the misandry bubble, collapses. Misandry is thus mathematically impossible to finance for any extended period of time. A state with a small government is far more sustainable than a state seeking an ever-expanding government, which then cannot be financed, and descends into a mass of contradictions that is the exact opposite of what the statists intended. See the gangster capitalism that dominates contemporary Russia. These four horsemen will all converge at the end of this decade to transfer the costs of misandry from men onto women, and on January 1st, 2020, we will assess how the misandry bubble popped and the fallout that women are suffering under for having made the mistake of letting feminists control their destiny. Note that I did not list the emergence of any men's rights movement as one of the four horsemen, as this is unlikely to happen for the aforementioned reasons. For those who dispute the four horsemen, I'd like to see their track record of predictions to compare against my own. Women had their four sirens, and now the pendulum has to swing at the same amplitude in the other direction. Keep the four horsemen in mind throughout this decade, and remember what you read here on the first day of 2010. Who should care? As we leave a decade where the prime threat to U.S. safety and prosperity was Islamic terrorism, and enter a decade where the prime threat is misandry, anyone concerned with any of the following topics should take heed. Anyone with a son, brother, nephew, or mentee entering marriage, particularly without the partial protection of a prenuptial agreement. As described earlier, he can be ruined, separated from his children, and jailed in a manner few would suspect could happen in any advanced democracy. The suicide rate of divorced men is shockingly high. Anyone who agrees that a civilization where most adults are part of two-parent families will always outcompete and displace a civilization where a large portion of adults are not leading two-parent families. Anyone with minor grandchildren, nieces and nephews, or great-grandchildren. The divorce laws incentivize using children as pawns during divorce, and no serious thinker can dispute the trouble that haunts the children of divorce for years thereafter. Feminists concoct bogus research about the role of the father being superfluous, but observation of real-world examples proves otherwise. Anyone who owns an expensive home in a community of families. The growing aversion of men for marriage will create fewer new families, and thus fewer buyers for those homes. I remind everyone that if they have 20% equity in their home and an 80% mortgage, even a 20% decline in home prices is a 100% decline in your equity, which might be all of your net worth. Detroit, the first major U.S. city to see a loss of beta male employment prospects, saw the average home price drop from $98,000 as recently as 2003 to just $14,000 today in January 2010. A decline smaller than this would devastate the net worth of remaining homeowners and can happen in any community of single-family homes. If you own a home, your net worth is inseparably tied to the formation and preservation of two-parent families. Anyone concerned about rising crime? 72% of African American children are born to single mothers, and the number among white children is approaching 30%. Furthermore, the mancession will eventually ensure that the only means of survival for many men is to form gangs and take valuables by force. Unloved men, who in the past would have been paired with wives, are easy for both gangs and terrorist organizations to recruit. Anyone concerned about the widening federal and state budget shortfalls in healthcare costs, for which the state continues to insist on raising taxes rather than cut spending. Fewer men choosing to work the long hours needed to earn high incomes will break the model of the top 10% paying 75% of taxes, and more men being jailed for alimony arrears, not being good enough in bed, or defending himself from spousal violence will drain tax coffers. It costs $60,000 a year to maintain a prisoner. Anyone who thinks the U.S. Constitution is a valuable document, innocent until proven guilty, does not apply in many areas of feminist heavy law. The previously discussed shadow state is using feminism to conduct all sorts of horrible tyranny against innocent men, which greatly compromises America's ability to claim that it is still the land of the free. Anyone concerned about national security. As more men feel that this society is betraying him, fewer will risk their lives in the military only to find that divorce lawyers have been persuading his wife to leave the marriage while he is deployed. Coming home from one battlefield only to be inserted in another is a shameful betrayal of our finest young men. Furthermore, I have already mentioned how British men are turning to Islamic courts in the hopes of avoiding ruin at the hands of British misandrist laws. Quite a few men may conclude that Islam offers them more than their native society that has turned against their gender, and will act towards self-preservation. Any woman who is appalled by the treatment of any woman who deviates from feminist doctrine, and who is troubled by the words and actions of self-proclaimed feminists today. If you believe that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, you should worry about what feminists are courting by kicking a friendly dog too many times. Lastly, anyone with a young daughter or sister who is about to enter a world where it is much harder for all but the most beautiful women to marry, where the costs of crazed feminism are soon going to be transferred away from men and onto women, even if she had no interest in this doctrine of hate. As stated in the executive summary at the start, feminists are leading average women into the abyss. I could list even more reasons to care, but the point is clear. The biggest challenge of the decade is summarized before us. Conclusion. I am just an observer and will not become an activist of any sort, although, as described earlier, being an inactivist in the spirit of Mahatma Gandhi is also powerful. As a futurist, I have to predict things before they become obvious to everyone else. Regular readers know of my track record of predictions being accurate, and heed my words when I say the further inflation and subsequent precipitous deflation of the Misandry Bubble will define the next American decade. So here, on the first day of the 2010s, I am unveiling the article that will spawn 1,000 other articles. As mentioned at the top, what you have just finished is the equivalent of someone in 1997 predicting the entire war on terror in vivid detail. The level of detail I have provided about the collapse of the Misandry Bubble will unfold with comparable accuracy as when this site predicted the real estate bubble 2 years beforehand, and the exact level the stock market would bottom at 6 months before the fact. I know a bubble when I see one, and Misandry is the premier one of this age. Bet against my predictions at your own risk. This website has predicted that the U.S. will still be the only superpower in 2030, and while we are not willing to rescind that prediction, I will introduce a caveat that U.S. vitality by 2030 is contingent on a satisfactory and orderly unwinding of the Misandry Bubble. It remains to be seen which society can create economic prosperity while still making sure both genders are treated well, and the U.S. is currently not on the right path in this regard. For this reason, I am less confident about a smooth deflation of the Misandry Bubble. Deflate it will, but it could be a turbulent hurricane. Only rural America can guide the rest of the nation into a more peaceful transition. Britain, however, may be beyond rescue.